I'm Sharon Chickering, and the date is June 27, 2023. I'm interviewing Diana M. Perkinson, one of the first women attorneys to practice in the Roanoke Valley of Virginia. This interview is part of the Oral History Project of the Virginia Women Attorneys Association Roanoke chapter, recording the oral histories of the first women attorneys to practice in the 23rd Judicial Circuit of the Commonwealth of Virginia. This interview is taking place in the offices of Woods, Rogers, Van Deventer, and Black in Roanoke, Virginia. The stenographer is Deborah Howard, and the videographer is Melissa Stevens. Diana, do I have your permission to record this interview?
You do.
All right. If you would, tell us a little bit about when and where you were born, and your family and your childhood and upbringing.
I was born April 13th, 1947 in Giles County. We lived in a small community called Green Valley on a family farm that my father and all of his siblings had been born and lived there. My grandfather had bought it. And actually, all of the siblings lived there until each of the women married.
Oh my goodness.
He had 4 older sisters, and then he was the next to the youngest. There were 4 girls and then 3 boys. I did not know those grandparents because they died while he was in service in World War II. But his philosophy, my grandfather's philosophy was, number one, the pastor needed to eat lunch at his house at least 2 or 3 times a month. And number 2, that all of his daughters should be educated. He, ahead of his time, he believed that they all, so one was a teacher, one was a librarian, one's a nurse, and one's a chemist. And he wanted his sons to either work on the farm or get public jobs to help his daughters be educated. That seemed to be ahead of his time, so I had that model. Then my mom was much younger than my dad, and she grew up in a totally different family. She was the oldest of 8. And my grandfather, her father, was a Finnish carpenter with plenty of habits that weren't the best, if you know what I mean. So I actually have an aunt and uncle, an aunt my age and an uncle younger than me on my mother's side.
Wow.
So actually my dad's oldest sister was the exact same age as my grandmother, my mother's side, which made for a very interesting family.
Certainly.
And I think what was unique about my childhood was my father's siblings, none of them had children at that point except one, so I had only one cousin. On my mother's side, most of the women, most of her sisters had 8 or 10. So the fact that my mom had only 3 was a joy for our family. So I grew up in that little small community, and when I got ready to start school, my dad's oldest sister was the librarian, and she was the librarian in the elementary school in Pearisburg. So rather than go to the local school, it was agreed that I would ride with her. I would go to Pearisburg school. Anyway, I was an only child for 10 years, 8.5 years, and then a brother was born, a surprise, and then another brother was born. So I was really fortunate. I was so excited. I went to church one Sunday and said, I got the best Christmas present ever. And my little friend said, what was it? And I said, a baby brother. And they went, they all had several siblings. They did not think that was a good Christmas. But when I started school, I would only been around adults. I mean, that's all you have in the country when you don't have siblings. And when loved school, I thought that was great. But when the teacher would leave the room and we were supposed to be on our little rugs, I would get up and leave because I couldn't see how I could stay in a room with 25 kids without an adult until my aunts would catch me, because one of them was the teacher and one of them was the librarian. But I think I was lucky because there was everyone thought reading was the best thing in the world. So every Saturday my dad would go grocery shopping. And he'd buy me a little golden book. So I would read the books, and then we would give them to my cousins who didn't have those books. But this was the beginning of the baby boomers, born in 47. And for the first time, they had 4 classes of first graders and all the way through school, because they never had that many kids enrolled in this tiny little Macy Elementary in Pearisburg. But that afforded the school system the ability to take the children who really might be able to be challenged a little bit more, and they didn't point it out to anybody, but we just got in classes where it was a little more challenging. They did that all through school, and I think that helped prepare someone coming from an ordinary public school ready to go to college. But, like I said, when I had my brothers were born, my mom said when they were so close together, they were only 18 months apart. When she came home with the second baby, she said, "Pick one." I said, "I'll take the baby. You haven't spoiled him yet." But by 10 years old, I was babysitting. I loved doing that. So I always thought working was a great thing.
So tell me a little bit about your educational background once you got through public school.
Oh, I applied to, it was clear I needed scholarships. My father was my mom did not work outside the home. She was a homemaker. And I was probably going to qualify for some academic scholarships, but I would need a lot of assistance because I can remember the first time my father ever had a paycheck that was more than $90.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Which, you know, we just thought when it was $100, we just thought that was incredible. So I applied to several colleges. I applied to Radford, I applied to state schools, but I also applied to Randolph-Macon. And my mom was concerned. She said, "This looks like the kids are wealthy there." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, they are." She said, "But we don't have that kind of money for clothes and so forth." I said, "My blue jeans are going to be just fine." Just like their blue jeans, because that was basically, we wore blue jeans when we were in college. But I was lucky enough to get a given scholarship. So from the time I entered Randolph-Macon until I finished, it was a commitment that someone had made to make sure that whatever I needed financially, in addition to working, would be available. And my job was a waitress. We all ate in our own dorms. We had dining rooms in every dorm. So that was a great job, and other people would be willing to substitute for me because they got to eat first and they got to
Lots of advantages. Yeah.
So it was easy to get to hire somebody to wait tables for me if I needed to be out of town or something. But that was the best thing that could have happened because it was truly liberal arts, and that's exactly what I needed and wanted. And the professors were excellent. They all had office hours. You just walk down the hall, knock on the door, and get to talk to your professors. The biggest class I had, I think, was 45. The rest of them were small.
Nice.
So it was a very supportive place for all of us, but certainly there just didn't seem to be any distinction between the scholarship students and my best friend in first year. Her father happened to be vice president of U.S. Steel, and
wow.
It just didn't make much difference.
Sure,
where you
sure.
come from.
So this was you graduated in '69, is that right?
I did. Started
Yeah.
in '65, graduated in '69.
Okay. And this was an all-women's college?
Yes,
Yeah.
in Lynchburg. As a matter of fact, I'm so fortunate. When I got to Lynchburg, obviously there'd been no integration of the restaurants and the dining
Wow.
facilities, and there is he is still living, very active African American minister there, and he ran a funeral home, and he and the students at Randolph-Macon formed the sort of ad hoc committee, and we sat in at the Five and Dime and
Oh my
ate
goodness.
meals there. We were really fortunate. The president of Randolph-Macon, you would have to say he was liberal. He believed that as long as we were not doing the wrong thing, we should be able to do whatever we wanted. So we were able to go to a trial, a very famous trial in Lynchburg, for a young man named Wansley. And I mention that because that's where I met Phil Hirschkopf, and there's another trial lawyer at that time, William Kunstler, was very famous,
Oh, my
New York
goodness.
lawyer. And at night, because they were representing him, he had already been convicted of rape of a woman that lived on Rivermont Avenue, where our college was located. And he was a teenager, and he did not, his attorney in the trial passed away. The judge wouldn't give a continuance.
Oh my goodness.
It was, apparently that trial was horrendous. But Phil Hirschkopf had just been licensed as a lawyer, and
Right.
he did the Loving case in Virginia for the ACLU. And of course, William Kunstler was the head trial lawyer. And they were able to it reversed. Judge Marriage reversed the decision and freed him eventually. So he went from having a death sentence for having been convicted of two rapes to two rapes to really being released.
That's
So
amazing.
we were fortunate to be able to go down.
Sure.
And the college didn't mind if we wanted to go down there. But it's funny because the Daily News, very conservative newspaper in Lynchburg, as you might imagine. And one day the editor walked up to me and said, "What if I called your parents tonight and told them where you were?" And I said, "They'd be really happy. Why don't you give them a call?" And he just couldn't believe that anybody's parents wouldn't be upset about them being,
That's amazing.
yeah, it was a different time. But because of that, we were able to go that first year, after first year of college, to Atlanta and meet Stokely Carmichael,
Wow.
Julian Bond. I got to meet Reverend Martin Luther King. Just, I guess it was the right time to be able to
Sure.
meet people who were influential at that point. But
So what was your area of study?
I went to college as a math major.
Wow.
Mary Sue Terry, who was our Attorney General at one point, and I and others went in the summer to colleges for the National Science Foundation. They wanted students who were good at math and really liked math to go to college for 2 or 3 weeks and study. So by the time I got to Roanoke-Macon, I was already at a level in math that I was put in a class with juniors. And my teacher was Korean. And I come from Giles County. We didn't have anyone that did, like that. And it was 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'm not a morning person. So after about pretty close to a semester, I said, I can't do this. This is beyond. It was beyond integral calculus at that point. And the dean said, "I agree with you. Transfer into philosophy because you've had enough math."
Oh my goodness.
So I liked philosophy, and then I got involved in political science. So my goal was to be in the Foreign Service until I figured out about my 3rd year in college that you're probably going to have to live in Washington until you get an assignment.
Sure.
I was not going to live in Washington, D.C. So I started searching for a different career. And at that point, I'd already met Frank Perkinson. He was involved in the Democratic Party, and he was the YD, the Young Democratic president that year. And they come to the colleges and talk. And the Republicans were very active at our college too. But and then I met 2 professors at UVA, and I just thought maybe I want to go to law school. So I decided to apply to several law schools because again I was looking for a scholarship if possible, and I was fortunate that at UVA I was able to get a scholarship. So. And it was more affordable than any of the private schools. But interestingly enough, I wrote to Washington and Lee for catalog.
Oh my
I thought
goodness.
that would be a great school to go to.
Yes.
And they refused to send me a catalog. They were not accepting women. 2 years later, they accepted women. And Phil Hirschkopf and I were still talking to each other. And he said, "I'll sue him for you." I said, "No, I want to pass the bar. I do not want to sue Washington and Lee because
I don't want to be an example.
No.
I want a career.
That's right. But anyway, it was good to be at UVA because, as you know, the Vietnam War protests were going on.
Yes.
And the law students, we all wore black armbands. And we were proud of the fact that none of our students who took over the dean's office, they left at the end of the day. They didn't stay there at night and create problems. So we tried to help them stay just inside the law so they didn't wind up being arrested. So we were out there in that regard. But there were, let's see, 18 women who enrolled the same year I did.
Interesting.
Out of 341, so we were 5%.
So you went from Randolph-Macon, an all-women's college, to being a 5% minority in law school. How did that feel?
Oh, it felt wonderful because all of the women students there at the time, and there were fewer students in the two upper grades, 2 and 3, could meet in the women's lounge. It was the bathroom, but we had couches and
Yes.
and comfortable chairs. And we were very close to each other, so I had one professor who was female at that time. Now, before I left, more women were hired, but it didn't seem unnatural at all. Randolph-Macon, you had to sign out if you were going someplace for the weekend. At UVA, as you can imagine,
They didn't make
it
you
was
do
a
that.
totally different situation. But,
So I noticed that you got your LLM, is that right?
LLB.
So tell me what the difference is between a JD and an LLB.
Well, actually, the LLB was the degree lawyers obtained until JDs became available. And Virginia didn't start out awarding JDs
Isn't that
until
interesting?
some time. So I had the option. And I wanted the old-fashioned one, the lawyer of legal letters. So I got an LLB. Other people in my class got a JD.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and we even had some classes we could take on a pass-fail basis.
Oh my
In
goodness.
law school, yes. I mean,
That's pretty progressive for that time.
it really was. I'm really fortunate. My job at UVA was assistant to Dean Paulson. He was the dean of the law school, and he wrote a criminal law book. As a matter of fact, it's one of the ones that was used at a lot of law schools. And he was revising it and editing it. And he said to me that I was probably the second best legal assistant he'd ever had. And I couldn't be number one because I insisted on going to class. I wouldn't miss class just to help him out. But and then Charlie Whitebread taught criminal procedure, and he was more of an actor than he was anything else. And so I came out of law school saying, I'm definitely going to be a criminal lawyer. So that's
wow.
how I started.
Interesting. Very
But
interesting.
at that point, Frank and I had become engaged, and we married in my last year of law school. And he had a significant civil collection practice. So I was in court a lot, but there were no public defenders, so people came and hired lawyers for criminal cases. And I had court-appointed cases too, but that was a great experience. I was interviewed by the Roanoke probably the second year after I got here. And I can remember saying things like, there are many innocent people in the jails. I just was dedicated to
Yes.
Not as many as I thought, but there were.
So you got your degree in 72 and were admitted to the bar in 72 and then came
73, February of 73.
Okay, and then you came directly to Roanoke.
I came to Roanoke in June as soon as we finished law school. I finished law school, and Frank also hired Jeff Krasno, and we were associates. And we basically were paid. Frank had a philosophy that the more you brought in, the more you should take home. So he figured out what our overhead should be, and basically we got to take home what we had once we contributed our overhead.
Nice.
The rest was ours. So I thought that was a pretty nice way to be an associate.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Incentive to.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you started out doing collections and criminal law. Okay, well, take me forward from there.
Well, actually, I considered to be a great deal of success in criminal law, and it might have been the novelty of being the only woman in private practice at the time. Because when I got here, Melba Perky had been licensed as an attorney, but she was working as a bankruptcy trustee and not actually in private practice per se at that point. And then soon afterwards, Ann Edenfield and other women got here, but at the beginning I was sort of a novelty. So that first summer, the bar, became a member of the Roanoke Bar immediately, and they said, well, we have our stag picnic. And I said, well, I can't go. And they go, yes, you can. You just can't bring your husband. I mean, you were supposed to bring a spouse. So quickly they changed it from a stag picnic to a lawyer-only picnic. That was funny. And about that time, as more women came to Roanoke, we had our own little informal, we get together for lunch at least once a month, if not more. And that's how the Roanoke, Virginia Women's Attorney Association in Roanoke got started. But we just shared information and told probably war stories about how some people didn't think we were really lawyers when we first got here. But
Did you have that experience?
I did. I went to because back then when judgments were entered, the clerk typed them into books, and then when they were paid, you needed to go to the clerk's office as an attorney and write out the release and get the clerk to acknowledge it. So I did that in Rockbridge County. Hadn't had any trouble before, and I marked all the books, and I asked the clerk to come help me, and she screamed at me, and she said, "You can't have, I can't have secretaries making releases of judgments."
Oh my gosh.
And I was a little embarrassed, and I said, "But I'm an attorney." She says, "Well, you're going to have to prove it."
Oh my goodness.
I said, "Well, all I can do is call Frank." So I wasn't carrying a card at that point. So I called. I said, "Frank, will you please tell her that I'm a lawyer?" And he goes, "Ma'am." She took some of these judgments. It was just funny. That's the only remarkable thing. She just couldn't believe that I'd written in her books. She was very upset.
So how about clientele? How did they take having a woman attorney?
It's really interesting when I got court appointed for criminal cases, and I'd go to the jail, which was in the municipal building is where our courts
Right.
were at that time. And the jail was obviously the fifth floor. And so if you needed to go see somebody in jail, you just took the elevator and you went to the jail. And I couldn't understand. I would explain my job to a criminal defendant and ask them what had happened. And then when we would get to the preliminary hearing, I'm hearing a totally different story. And I realized that I had to do something. So I'm not proud of it, but I learned to speak their language. And I recall going into a jail cell one time and said, "You blankety 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 blank, if you don't tell me the truth, I'm not going to jail. You're going to jail."
Oh wow.
And this young African American, he reeled back and he told me the truth. It was so exciting. So I figured that you needed to, be very clear, because they were giving me the grandmother version.
Right, right. And it's always frustrating when the police officer knows more than you do.
Yes, it is very frustrating. But I was really lucky when I was practicing here. One of the things that is of interest is we had separate courts. We had Hustings Court, which was criminal.
Okay.
Judge Ballou, and that's where I spent a lot of my time. And we had Chancery Court, which did all the divorces and all the chancery matters. And of course that was Judge Feller, Stanford Fellers. And then we had Circuit Court, which did accidents and other just civil matters. And that was Tom Fox. So you actually had to file something in one of three courts.
Right.
And have the headings right.
Right, right.
But I'll say one thing for Judge Fellers. To my knowledge, he was only reversed one time in his entire career.
Wow.
But he had a red pencil. And so he taught us very quickly how to write up decrees in divorces. Because he would just red pencil it, because he said, you want to get it right. You don't want somebody to challenge this later on.
And he is right about that.
He was very good.
How did you feel you were received by the judges?
The judges couldn't have been any kinder or nicer. Monk Davis in Franklin County, Judge Ballou in particular, he always wanted, much like Judge Weckstein, if you made an objection, and he would rule on it, but then he said, "What is your authority for that?" So it's much more of a, sort of like being back in law school.
Right,
which
right.
really did help. If you were going to make objections, you better have the right reason for that. But so I thought the judges couldn't have been any kinder. Now, Mary, who was Judge Hoback's secretary, they were called, now she's very protective of Judge Hoback. And so I learned pretty quickly that Mary and I needed to be friends. Otherwise, you weren't going to get to see the judge.
She's the gatekeeper, yes.
Yeah, and she was that way with male lawyers as well as female lawyers. But the clerk's office, I'll have to say, if you were smart enough to go to the clerk's office in our local courts and just ask, they were very kind to suggest things you might want to try that might work. And the members of the bar, if they've been practicing 15 years or more, couldn't have been kinder. There's a little maybe animosity sometimes among your contemporaries, maybe, but not really. But the older lawyers couldn't have been any nicer to accommodating. I was fortunate. I had a case, and I was very nervous about it because it involved a partner at Woods Rogers. And so I went through the front door to see the partner. I had sued his client, it was his drugstore, for misfilling a prescription. And Mr. Rogers Sr.'s office was right there at the front. He called me in because he knew who I was. And we were talking, and he said, what brings you here? And I told him. And I said, I'm really nervous because that's who I'm going to meet with. And he said, if he gives you any trouble at all, you come right back down here. And we'll all meet together. I thought that was so sweet. Of course, I didn't need that, but it sure was a confidence booster.
Sure, sure. So tell me a little bit about how things changed in your practice. You kind of moved into the domestic area.
Actually, Frank had the philosophy that we were general practitioners, and so when people came through the door, if he said, if you have the ability to handle the case, take it, and you'll learn a whole lot more. So there was a lot of domestic that came through the door, and I enjoyed doing that too. And that's where I had a lot of success, really. Back then, there was no Court of Appeals, and in order to appeal something from the circuit court, you wound up asking for a writ. You had to petition for an appeal.
Wow.
And I petitioned for at least 4 or 5 and got them to accept the case and got reversal. So
That's pretty impressive.
Really happy.
Yes.
One of them was a local judge who had, I'll never forget, he went on the record to explain how he was going to rule in a custody case. These parties, the mother and father, had been separated for well over a year, and the husband had hired a private detective to investigate his wife. And she could document that he had beaten her twice while she was pregnant with their son.
Wow.
And our local judge believed that she likely committed adultery. A local lawyer had been at her home, and the detective had said that, the private detective had said that he stayed all night. And he said yes, he testified. He said, I did. I've fallen asleep a couple times on the couch, but there was no romantic relationship. And the judge said, how can I award custody of this 8-year-old boy to a man who's twice beaten his wife while pregnant? On the other hand, how can I award custody to a woman who has clearly committed adultery? And I thought that was reversible error.
Yes.
The Supreme Court said so too. And it was 2 years later that it got reversed and she got custody. But, you know, that judge was so kind, he even congratulated me on getting it reversed. So I thought that was nice on his part.
Very, very interesting. So, obviously, they were all male judges initially,
yes.
and then Judge Strickland took the bench. So, tell me, what is your thought about how things progressed that we got to the point where, at least at some point, we were able, I think it was 92, that we were able to. Well, I guess she finished in 92.
Right. Yeah, she actually was a year behind us in law school. We had a small group, study group, and Art and I were in the same group. And
Art was her husband.
Art
Yes.
Strickland, her husband. And she kept getting all the questions right when we were doing the studying at night. She was in history at that point, graduate history. And we were looking around saying, Art, you know, she's just a natural for this. And I know she thought about entering law school, and she did. And we were really proud of her because she was very capable in circuit court after having been in the district court. And I really do think that we, as a group of lawyers, kind of fell down on the job because we haven't had another circuit judge. And other areas of the state have had multiple women. I don't know why we haven't. I know that we've all said that we were ready to support other candidates. And I know I've tried to encourage several lawyers that I think would just do an excellent job
Sure.
in circuit court. But it seemed like that they were freely supported for juvenile court. And we, at one point we had all but one
Right. Yes. Yes.
were
yes.
women. But
And I was wrong. It was 2002 that she retired. So it's been over 20 years.
Right.
Yes.
And
since,
I remember Judge Talevi, she started as a public defender. And the first time I ever heard her make a closing argument in a case, I was waiting for another case to be heard. And I was like, she just quoted the U.S. Constitution. I'm so proud of her. Because I knew and practiced with her father, Jack Ward.
Yes.
And I once said to him, and we were friends, I said, your daughter is so smart, And he said, yeah, she's a lot better lawyer than I am. He recognized that. But again, there are such capable women, and I don't know why we haven't been able to get any more on the bench. But I think certainly there's women in the Virginia Women's Attorney Association who are actually actively holding the conferences to help women do what they need to do to be candidates for
Sure.
the judgeships.
So, is there anybody in particular, a judge or other attorneys that you admired and felt you learned a lot from?
Absolutely. Ken Treview. He and I
Yes.
practiced law together before he went on the bench, and I'll never forget, there was this, I sued a man, and so he was the defendant in the case, and he went to federal court and sued Judge Treview and myself. And I was young and panicking, and I called and asked if I could speak to Judge Treview. And he said, will you calm down? We have the same carrier. Because he had represented
Yes.
professional liability carriers. So, and of course that was disposed of. But there were, Judge Ballou probably was a very influential judge. But I admired attorneys just for their ability. I mean, Bob, Bill Poff. Sometimes Frank and I would go out and get something to eat and then go back to the office because we had a philosophy we weren't going to take legal work home.
Sure.
And carry it home to the farm. And he and his wife Meg would be out having dinner, and he would go back to Woods Rogers and work until 10 o'clock at night. And he associated Frank in some cases. He represented the company, and Frank and I represented the union, Martinsville Nylon. And so we got to know him fairly well, but he obviously was a brilliant lawyer and a workaholic, but I admired him.
So, were there any particular judges or fellow attorneys that you felt treated you differently due to your gender, whether positively or negatively?
Yes, and it was almost exclusively positively. Sort of embarrassingly, when I would go to Franklin County, Andrew Davis Sr.
Yes.
Would say, the esteemed lawyer from Roanoke is here, and I think she should go first, Judge, and all the other lawyers were like, ooh. But that was just his nature, as was Mr. Rogers Sr., like I said,
Yes.
when I came over here. Couldn't have been any more cordial and really just welcoming, and not in a way that says I didn't belong, in a way of, come on, we're glad to have you as an attorney. I didn't receive, maybe somebody wanted to be negative, but I didn't perceive it, so it wasn't a problem. No, really, I will say that being willing to say, I don't know exactly how to do this, or is this pleading correct in the beginning, probably is a lot better than some lawyers' attitudes that we've seen come in lately with I know it all and
Yes. Yes.
please help me.
Yes. Yes. So, you and Frank continued to practice after y'all
did.
divorced.
We married in 1972. We separated we were separated in 82. And we didn't divorce until one of us had to ask the other for divorce. We already knew whoever asked was going to have to concede some property.
Oh, yes.
So we outlasted each other, but sadly, his fiance was so she just thought that maybe I was the reason that we weren't getting divorced. I said, just tell him to ask me. It's not a problem. We'll do it tomorrow. And we did it fairly quickly at the end. But we continued to practice law because I really like doing appellate work, and I'm fairly good at it. And he was always was involved in municipal government and did zoning and planning, and our practices were different. And I admired him as an attorney, and I felt like neither one of us wanted to shoot ourselves in the foot, so we continued to practice together.
That's nice.
Yeah.
So did John Malumpy?
John read law in our office. He was our computer programmer, because Frank had gotten a computer years before to handle the collection practice, and it was one of the big mainframe computers.
Wow.
And so it had to be programmed, and John Malumpy was the programmer at the time, and he was interested in the law. So he did his regular job at night and came to work every day. I think that was the difference for John. He went everywhere we went, to every case, from the interview all the way through the trial. And as a matter of fact, I represented a local credit union, small loan company, Creditway, and Legal Aid sued our client for violating the truth in lending law. And we won it at the district court, and Legal Aid appealed it to the Fourth Circuit. And John was able to argue with me.
Nice.
It was one of the first cases that he argued after being licensed. But we were really proud of him because he did a great job on the bar, because he had been studying and coming to work every day as though he was already a lawyer in a way.
Yes.
He knew the ropes, so to speak. But
well, and you mentioned Jeff Krasno. I had read in an interview with him by the newspaper, I guess when he was getting ready to retire, and he remembered very fondly that he felt he was mentored well when he was practicing with your firm.
We had a good, Jeff and I were friends in law school, and the only reason he left, and we were glad that he left, was that he wanted to advertise. And Frank just felt real strongly there were no lawyers advertising on TV at that time. And Frank just felt like that was somehow unseemly. And Jeff really did it well. I mean, I can remember his commercials with the chainsaw and cutting the table in half. And, but because of that, he went out on his own. And yeah, as a matter of fact, I just was in Richmond for the 50 lawyers who've been practicing for 50 years.
Wow.
For the ceremony, and they give you a very beautiful plaque, by the way. And of course, other people tease and say the only thing you have to do is, number one, not die, number two, not mess up your license to get there. But there were, informally, it looks to me like there were probably 30 women who had continued to practice. But I was the only one who went.
Wow.
So they made a big deal. We have one woman who came to get her certificate. But it was nice to see a lot of my classmates
Absolutely.
I hadn't seen for a while.
Absolutely. So what do you see in terms of the progress of how women attorneys have been accommodated by the courts related to having children and those sorts of things? Do you see...
I do. Judge Strickland is to be admired for the fact that my relationship with Lloyd Marshall lasted about 29 years after Frank and I separated and eventually divorced. And he flew Woodes Rogers. And she worked and was doing depositions in Bristol and all across the state right before each of her children were born. Now, she did take time off after the children were each child was born, but she worked extremely hard and under the tutelage of Bill Poff, so you worked very hard. But yes, I think the firms are now acknowledging that it is valuable to have, to have women, and in order to have women, you have to let them have some flexibility. And so I enjoy hearing Monica Mundy speak about, what the situation has been with the bigger firms. But I do think the bigger firms have acknowledged that you can be a very good lawyer and you can have periods of time in which you need to do less work and still contribute.
Yes.
to the overall part of the firm. So I'm glad to see they're not relegated to staying, they become partners now,
Right,
probably.
right. So tell me a little bit about your involvement with the Bar Association and the Women's Attorneys Association and those sorts of things, and what do you think is the importance of being involved in that way?
You know, I think the Women Attorney Association was a great idea. And I can remember members of the bar going, "That's not fair. You don't." And we said, "We'll take your money. You can be a member." And several of them do come. They're not related to the women, but they've
Right.
joined and so forth. But I think it really did help, especially, I'm going to say in the last, you know, as you mentioned, the employers, especially the firms, were not as accommodating to women, and it was like either or. Either you're going to be an attorney or you're going to be raising children, but it was hard for them to conceive of how they could do both. And I ran into that when I was applying for law school. The University of Richmond said, "You're welcome to come, but we're not going to give you a scholarship because you're probably going to be raising children."
Oh my goodness. They really
said it out
that?
loud, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I said, "Well, I can't come if I can't get a scholarship," so that's a problem.
Thank you.
Thank you for expressing it. But no, I think things are changing. I'm really proud of the women statewide for continuing to have the programs that were valuable to all lawyers and well received, but especially for coming up with things to encourage women to have goals for the bench. And I think in federal court we seem to be doing fairly well.
We do.
And I'm very proud of that. But we really do, I don't know what it's going to take, but we really do need to work on our circuit and general district benches because women need to be, people need to see others like them on the bench. I think that's very important for all kinds of reasons.
Yes, so we've got Judge Elizabeth Dillon in the federal court, and then Kai Mimmer has just been selected to go through the process as well. That's good progress.
That is good progress.
It is.
And I will say that I think a lot of our, at least my experience, our federal judges feel the same way. They are very anxious to get women locally. And I don't know, I guess we're a pretty big bar in Roanoke. I've always enjoyed the bar activities. And I've learned a lot. You know, the programs have been informative, and I'm glad I was able to serve, as a director at one point. Because I think what you can contribute to your community is, it's part of, if you are educated and you have an ability and you can give back something that you know how to do, that's what you should be doing.
And you've done that with other civic organizations as well. Tell me a little bit about that.
My father served in World War II, and he was very clear that as compared with the Red Cross and with the Salvation Army, the Salvation Army took care of soldiers. They helped them contact home. They tried to get them home if they were losing a parent to death. And the Red Cross sold them coffee and sold them cigarettes, and it was, he always thought the Salvation Army was where our family wanted to contribute for our charitable dollars. So when I got to Roanoke, and they ran the only domestic violence shelter west of, I guess, Charlottesville, I guess, at that point, it was natural to want to serve there. So I was on that. We called it an advisory committee because Salvation Army, of course, has their own structure. But that, to me, they do more with less. They don't pay their staff very much money, and they do a lot of good, I think, in most areas. So that's been, and then I had a special interest in mental health because over time in divorce work and representing children, you learn about the issues that parents and children have that create barriers to them and they wind up in court sometimes based on that mental health issues. And in the past, as Judge Trumpeter's often said, people were embarrassed about having mental health problems, but they're no different than diabetes or an endocrinology problem or anything else. It's just a part of the body that needs help. So I was pleased to be able to refer kids who were in foster care to the program that Diane Kelly ran with Mental Health America, and she convinced me to move forward. And at one point I was president of the local chapter. But you know, all of the agencies competing for dollars, there just wasn't any way to keep going forward. But we were able to transition the collaborative, which provides free counseling, free psychiatric care from our fellows at Carilion, and free medication to people who have mental health diagnosis. And that's now at Bradley. And they built a whole new
the Bradley
wing.
Free Clinic.
Yes,
okay.
They took it over. We gave them the money that we had
Oh, my
left.
goodness.
And they promised to do it, and they've done a splendid job because the doctors really support Bradley. And that support is translated into better conference rooms, or better exam rooms for the counseling and so forth. So I think the fact that one agency may go out of business, as long as some other agency locally picks it up, all is well.
Right, right. So is there a particular case that stands out to you as a very special one?
There are probably two or three. I mentioned the one about the divorce and the custody case, which the little boy, the little 8-year-old that I was speaking about, told his dad he wanted to live with him because he felt sure his mom could move mountains and his mom would not lose custody. He was downhearted when his father was awarded custody, but of course in a couple of years it got straightened down. I represented ex-wife of an attorney to challenge his discharge in bankruptcy. He was claiming that his postnuptial agreement, where he agreed to pay for the college education of the children, that's what she negotiated for. She didn't negotiate particularly for spousal support, but she wanted their children to be educated, college educated. And the bankruptcy judge said, yes, that was in the nature of child support. He appealed it to the Fourth Circuit and did not get his appeal in on time. And fortunately, the bankruptcy judge had said to him, yes, the order's been entered, you endorsed it. And Ms. Perkinson sent it in and sent you the cover letter, and you could expect that it would be entered, and your 10 days have expired.
Yes.
And
yes.
It's not excusable neglect. So it pleased me for her that he was required to educate their children. And to have it non-dischargeable there was a lot of litigation at that time about what is and what is not dischargeable in bankruptcy.
Yes.
And, but
You've done a whole lot of different types of law. I mean, you know, when you think about the breadth of that, and it is the solo, well, not the solo practitioner, but a general practice type of thing. And you pivoted more recently into guardian ad litem work. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. In 1992, the Supreme Court, Virginia, said that all children who leave their home for abuse and neglect must have an attorney, a guardian ad litem. And as you know, often children in custody cases, whether the parents were married or not, get a guardian ad litem if there's a disagreement between the parents about what's best in terms of custody. Now, usually with two good divorce practitioners, sometimes they don't want that extra expense for their clients of a guardian ad litem. But representing kids it's the reason I'm still practicing at this age. I get up every morning and I'm glad to go and do the work that I get to do. And people say, well, don't you hear horror stories and sad situations? Of course. But kids are so appreciative when they realize someone is focusing on them. And it's subtle, but if you come to the house and thank them for letting you come and meet with them, they're thinking, I didn't let you come, but okay, maybe you do belong to me, maybe you don't belong to my parents. But it's just, to me, helping parents come up with solutions that they can tolerate. That's the way I want to put it. And I've had people come back to me, even divorce clients come back to me and say, I really didn't like you at all when you said, we'll fight about the money, we'll fight about the property, we will not fight about the kids, because, you know, I admitted he is an okay dad. And she said, my children have actually thanked me now because I didn't demean their father or whatever. So I do think you can take the high road sometimes.
Anything else in terms of your experiences that you want to talk about?
My very first civil jury trial, I represented, she was a widow, she was 60, I thought that was pretty old at the time, I don't think so now. And she had hired a roofer, and he had told her he needed money for the materials, and I think he overestimated what the materials would be. And so he did nothing. He took the money, and we couldn't get him to do anything, even after I started to represent her. So I sued him in court, and had a jury, and they awarded her $9,000, which is what another company said it would cost to have the roof done at that point. And she cried when the jury rendered their verdict. She was so happy. She didn't have much money at all. And I can remember there was a tear or two in one of the jurors' eyes, and it just made me feel good that juries, I believe, get it right more often than they don't.
We'll never know how they reach their conclusions.
No, we don't. We don't. And sometimes we wonder if they got information from outside the courtroom that rendered their decision. But
especially these days with cell phones.
You're right.
So what are your thoughts about the fact that the Roanoke Bar Association, for the first time since it was incorporated in 1925, has an all-female board and all-female officers?
I think it is fantastic. And last year, as you know, the officers that was true too. I just can't say enough. I think it ought not to matter. We ought to fill any job for which we're interested and qualified. And I think in many respects we're coming to that. I'm not saying that people may want people want a female doctor or a male doctor. They want a female lawyer or they don't. But I really do think we're lucky that now the women in our area are extremely capable, and I think they should go right on the bench. That's what I think.
So overall, what are your thoughts about, you came to Roanoke in the mid-70s, basically, and just the general area and how we've progressed in Roanoke?
When I got here, everyone knew the railroad was the biggest employer, and very quickly, Carilion became, and we did represent a lot of the hospitals back then, the collection of accounts, and some of their leaders back then decided to bring in the best of the cancer doctors. I remember when Dr. Roanoke got here from New York, and probably we remember him most now from running restaurants, but at the time he's quite an esteemed cancer doctor. But I think over time it's changed. It's a shame that some of our communities in Roanoke were demolished so that we could have the Civic Center and other things. But I do think that Roanoke has a lot of attraction, the natural beauty of it. And people who've come here, I met a young lawyer who said that he came here to take the bar, and then he was just like, gee, I think this would be a great place to live. So he got a job, and he said, I think there's something to stay here the rest of my life. So there is something appealing, I think, about this area. We're certainly small enough that you don't have a huge commute. On the other hand, we have a lot of activities going on, especially outdoors.
So what do you consider other life accomplishments, both law-related and otherwise?
Well, I used to raise and race horses, and I enjoyed doing that. And then I realized that I was working, and one horse would win money, and then I would write the checks for the other horse. So I pretty soon decided maybe if you want to race horses, you should sell them and not try to race them all. So that's what I did for years. I think we can accomplishments just to try to see things from another person's point of view. I think over time, I'm told I'm a good listener, and sometimes that's what's needed. And I've been appointed once in a case to represent a parent that actually had had an excellent lawyer before, but she didn't trust her, and so I got a call and said, I need you to represent this mother, and I said, I was in court that day. No, thank you. They said, I'm sorry, you don't understand. Judge Bound says you're going to represent this. Oh, okay, no problem. But we spent 8 hours in my office because she clearly thought that she should rent out her home and have her children camp up on the mountain.
Oh my goodness.
She was not fulfilling her duties, and so her children were in foster care. And that day we had, I'm sure I offered her something to drink, but we did not stop for lunch or anything else. We went right through. And at the end, I said, is that everything you need to tell me? Mm-hmm. And she said, yes. And I said, okay, we'll never speak of this again. Because in court, she would always start at the beginning, and she had a hard time addressing what was going on right now. She always wanted to sort of tell the story. So we got to court, I'll never forget, and I called her to the witness stand, and I asked her a question, and she started with the older, and then she looked at me and she said, and we will never speak of it again. And Judge Bounds was like, so she did get her children back. She moved to Floyd, which was a very supportive community, and she was able to accomplish what she needed to accomplish and recognize that her children needed a home. They did not need to camp. And so it pleased me that listening sometimes is what can help somebody then maybe do a better job in court.
Yes, yes. Well, you truly have been a trailblazer, not only for women in the law in Virginia and in particular in the Roanoke Valley. What are your observations of the progress or lack thereof of the equality of women attorneys in Virginia and elsewhere and women on the bench?
Did you say equality?
Mm-hmm.
We do not reflect our population. We need, in my expectations, as many women lawyers, judges as there are in the population. They come to the law with all different kinds of backgrounds, but they have a distinct way of looking at things. We all know that. So do people of different races and cultures. And we're certainly trying to appreciate that now in the Roanoke Valley. We're fortunate that we've been a settling point for a lot of people who've come from other countries. So I really do think we just need to try as lawyers, and we're dependent on our legislators.
Yes.
That's the unique part of our judicial selection system. But I would hope that they would recognize that it is the more inclusive we have from the judicial point of view, it just naturally is going to lift up citizens, period.
Do you have any message you wish to give women just coming into the practice of law today?
Aim for whatever you want to do in your career, because people before you have assumed that we should be accepted just on our ability and not anything to do with our gender or race. And I think it's time for you to just aim high, and hopefully the bar will support you.
And what would you most like your legacy to be?
I think what you have been able to accomplish, either one-on-one or for people who needed a boost, that really should be the legacy. I've been approached by a young boy that lived in my community in Boone's Mill, and he relayed a story that I'd honestly forgotten about, that he clearly was a young man who was gay in his family of males, and he was teased by his brothers, and he said that I'd said to him, one day your brothers are going to depend on you, so just don't lose heart. And it turned out that he was a successful businessman, and a couple of his brothers have gotten in trouble and had to come to him for money or whatever. And he said it really meant a lot, and I didn't even know that I had said something that would help him as a child. So I think if there are people who've been helped along the way, that should be enough.
Thank you for participating. This has been a lovely interview, and I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.